Imagine the palace nursery, gilded cribs, velvet blankets, and a baby the court hoped no one would ever see. Royalty loved to parade their heirs, but when a child was born, twisted, limbless, or monstrously disfigured, the dynasty had a problem. These children were often erased from portraits, hidden in remote castles, or quietly buried before their first birthday. Tonight, we peel back the velvet curtain on the heirs who were never meant to be remembered and discover the grotesque fates of royalty's darkest secrets. Spain's hidden Habsburg babies. Let's start with the Habsburgs, because no dynasty was more committed to the idea of marrying your cousin until the family tree looked like a pretzel. The results were horrifying. Babies were born with jaws so deformed they couldn't close their mouths, tongues so swollen they couldn't swallow, and eyes bulging like grotesque gargoyles perched on a cathedral. The family called it divine right. Everyone else called it inbreeding on steroids. Official records were neat and tidy. Stillbirth. Infant mortality. Very polite phrases to cover the fact that entire nurseries were filled with children too twisted to ever be displayed. But midwives whispered the truth that some of these infants were smuggled to remote monasteries, locked away in cold stone rooms until nature solved the dynasty's embarrassment. Others never left the birthing chamber alive. The irony? These same kings and queens commissioned lavish portraits of themselves dripping in jewels and righteousness, while behind closed doors their bloodline was quietly rotting. Spain might have been most Catholic, but God apparently had a cruel sense of humor. And if you thought that was bad, wait until you meet the Tudors' own monstrous secret, the Tudor monster of England. Now to England, where Henry VIII collected wives the way modern people collect failed gym memberships. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was already teetering on thin ice when she miscarried in 1536. The midwives whispered that what slid from her body wasn't the healthy heir Henry demanded, but a grotesque fetus with a twisted spine and monstrous features. Whether the story was fact or carefully sharpened propaganda, it was enough to make Henry recoil in disgust. To him, the child wasn't just malformed, it was a divine message, proof that his witch of a wife had cursed his throne. Suddenly, Anne wasn't a queen. She was a villain in a morality play, and the audience was sharpening the axe. Within months, she was kneeling before a French swordsman, her head neatly removed, and Henry had already lined up his next bride. The irony? The defender of the faith, who split from Rome for a healthy heir, left a bloody trail of dead wives and deformed infants behind him. But if you thought Tudor propaganda was vicious, wait until you see how France turned deformity into a supernatural scandal. The Bourbon changeling child. France loved its fairy tales, but one Bourbon heir was rumoured to be the stuff of nightmares. Born so twisted he couldn't walk and barely sat upright, whispers spread that this child wasn't even royal at all but a changeling. The story went that the real infant, a healthy prince, was swapped with a peasant baby cursed by demons, while the true heir was left to rot in some convent cellar. Convenient, wasn't it? A little supernatural scapegoating to cover up the dynasty's bad genetics. Courtiers mocked him behind fans and lace handkerchiefs, calling him a living omen. Priests declared his warped body proof of God's judgment against royal sin. And Versailles, that glittering temple of control and performance, had no stage lights for imperfection. The child became an embarrassment shoved into the shadows. The cruel irony. In a palace where wigs were taller than men and makeup was practically plaster, deformity was considered unnatural. Perfection was theatre, deformity was scandal. But France wasn't the only stage where malformed heirs were erased. In Russia, the Romanovs had their own chilling method of handling unfit royalty. The Romanov burials, before baptism. In Russia, deformity wasn't just a scandal, it was a curse. The Romanovs, obsessed with the illusion of divine favor, had no room for heirs who looked like God had rejected them outright. The custom was chillingly simple. If a child was born twisted, hydrocephalic, or monstrously deformed, the priest didn't bless it. No baptism, no holy water, no ceremony. Instead, the child was bundled in silence and carried not to the chapel, but to the graveyard. The records are littered with vague entries. Infant death, stillborn, return to God. Euphemisms designed to hide the fact that these babies often cried, breathed, and lived, just not for long. Midwives whispered that some were smothered before sunrise, their tiny bodies lowered into the frozen earth before anyone outside the birthing room could ever see them. For the Romanovs, erasing a malformed heir was less risky than allowing whispers of divine punishment to spread. In a court that built its power on God's approval, a hunchbacked prince or a twisted princess was political suicide. better a secret grave than a throne with horns, and if Russia's way was brutal, Bavaria's solution was even more grotesque. They didn't hide their monster child, they paraded him. The Bavarian wolf boy. Not every royal deformity was hidden away. In 16th century Bavaria, one child was born with a condition that covered his body in thick, dark hair. Hypertrichosis, we call it now. Back then, he was the wolf boy. Imagine a prince who looked less like a cherub in silk and more like a stray dog dressed in brocade. Instead of protecting him, his family leaned into the spectacle. He was paraded before nobles like some grotesque pet, the ultimate party trick for Europe's most bored aristocrats. Portraits survive, showing a small, sad-eyed boy in fine fabrics, his face framed by fur as though God had played a cruel joke on the royal bloodline. Courtiers pointed, laughed, and whispered about curses. Some called him a marvel, others saw him as proof of sin crawling on four legs. And his fate? When the novelty wore off, he was sold off like a carnival attraction. The royal child became less a prince and more a freak on tour. It's a bitter irony sometimes being remembered was far crueler than being erased. But if Bavaria turned deformity into entertainment, Vienna found a darker solution: lock the children away and forget them altogether. The Habsburg idiot princes. Not every royal deformity could be seen on the outside. In Vienna, the Habsburg dynasty, already collapsing under centuries of inbreeding, produced children whose minds never left the nursery. Two boys in particular became whispered legends, the idiot princes. They weren't hidden in monasteries or paraded like curiosities. They were locked in an upstairs chamber of the palace, their meals shoved through a hatch like prisoners. Servants were forbidden to speak of them. Visitors to court sometimes noticed faint echoes, strange cries drifting down corridors, the sound of hands pounding against shutters. But when asked, courtiers brushed it off. The wind, the servants, your imagination. Behind the gilded walls, these princes grew up without ever being allowed to grow at all. No education, no sunlight, no throne. Just endless silence broken by the scrape of trays sliding through a door. It's almost poetic. A dynasty obsessed with power and control, brought low by its own bloodline, raising heirs who couldn't even feed themselves. Forgotten in life, erased in death. But in Florence, the Medicis didn't just hide their broken children. They experimented on them with results even more nightmarish. The Medici's grotesque experiments. Florence adored the Medici, name patrons of art, power brokers of Europe, smug kings of culture. But behind their marble palaces and frescoed chapels, the family hid a fascination with deformity that was anything but elegant. When a child was born bent or broken, the solution wasn't secrecy. It was experimentation. Accounts speak of infants strapped to wooden braces meant to straighten crooked spines, their tiny limbs pulled taut until bones snapped. Others were force-fed mercury concoctions, the very same poison alchemists swore could purify corrupted flesh. Weekly bleedings drained them of strength until there was nothing left but pale little corpses. The family called it healing. Everyone else might have called it torture. The irony: these were the same Medicis who commissioned Michelangelo to sculpt perfection from marble. Yet when flesh didn't match their ideals, they treated children like botched statues to be hammered into shape or shattered in the process. Florence celebrated their genius, but their nurseries were laboratories of pain. And if that sounds bleak, wait until you hear how most of these children's stories ended. Not as scandals, not as legends, but as nothing at all. The final curtain, erased from history. For every grotesque tale we've uncovered, dozens more were smothered before they even drew breath. Palaces kept their walls polished, their portraits pristine, their chronicles spotless. The malformed children, they became footnotes disguised as infant mortality, erased with a quill stroke as if they'd never wailed in the night. Some were buried in nameless plots under palace gardens, their tiny coffins unmarked. Others were quietly bricked into monastery crypts, their existence whispered about only by servants too lowly to be believed. No portraits, no statues, no legacy, just a silence so heavy it feels intentional because it was. The cruelest fate wasn't to be ridiculed or paraded like a monster. It was to vanish completely, denied even the dignity of being remembered. History loves its crowns and coronations, but these children were the shadows behind the throne, erased for the sake of perfection. And perhaps that's the darkest twist. Their bloodlines ruled empires, yet their names didn't even survive the nursery. But before we close the book, let's take one last bitter look at what their absence really says about royal power. History celebrates crowns, coronations, and royal heirs, but never the malformed infants who rattled behind locked nursery doors. They were proof that divine right could fail, that incest rotted thrones from the inside. Some were hidden, some were exploited, most were buried nameless. In the end, they remind us that royal blood was never magical. It was fragile, corruptible, and just as prone to nature's cruelty as any peasants. The forgotten children of kings and queens may be gone, but their ghostly absence still haunts the history books.